All right, everybody, thank you for joining us today. I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Sam Goldberg. He's an assistant professor. Oh, great. We are being recorded. There we go. Dr. Sam Goldberg here is an assistant professor of Marine Geosciences at the University of Miami and a core faculty member at the Institute for Data Science and Computing. He holds an AB, not a BA, an AB in Earth and Planetary Sciences from Harvard and a PhD in Geology from MIT. And his research focuses on the processes shaping Earth's landscapes and the factors influencing landscape evolution. And thank you, Dr. Sam Goldberg.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you all for showing up on a Friday afternoon. Woo! So before I get into the science, I want to introduce myself a little bit. So as Holly introduced me, I'm a geologist, and in particular, I'm a geomorphologist, which means I study Earth's landscapes and the surface environments that we live and walk around in every day. So within that, the questions, the very big picture that I think about in my scientific life are, how do Earth's landscapes or surface environments evolve over different timescales, meaning from annual, decadal, millennial to millions of years? Within that, what are the physical processes responsible for shaping those landscapes, and how are they contributing to evolution that occurs and the net resulting landscape that we can go out and observe today? And then from those processes, what's controlling how they work? What are the different environmental factors, geological, and even human factors, all of these external influences on those physical processes and the resulting landscape? So that's kind of the big picture questions that guide my thinking. And when I got here to South Florida a few years ago, I was trying to think, how could I apply these questions to locally relevant problems? My PhD mostly focused on rivers, and we don't really have classical rivers here, but we do have the river of grass. Sorry. So that's kind of what I was thinking about. How could I apply some of my experience to more locally relevant problems? So different techniques that I use different kinds of observations. Today, mostly going to be talking about remote sensing, like this satellite image behind me. I use different sorts of techniques to analyze and make sense of that data. How do you take a lot of raw data and tell an interesting scientific story out of it? I'm not going to talk about this today, but I also use more traditional forward numerical modeling in some of my other work. So I'm going to start off with just a quick overview of what the Everglades are and how they work. Many of you probably already know this and probably know more than me about it, but we'll lay the foundations for the sake of thoroughness. So as I'm sure most of you know already, the Everglades to the west of us is our local natural environment. It is a subtropical wetland. In this satellite image, pretty much everything here that's dark, west of the industrialized region, the urbanized region, that is the Everglades. As a wetland, it is, of course, shaped by water and the flow of water through the landscape. South Florida may be very flat, but it's not entirely flat. There's a little bit of topographic slope, and that's enough to drive water flow. In its original undisturbed state, that flow originated up north in Lake Okeechobee and then flowed south, following the topographic gradient towards the southwest towards Florida Bay and the Gulf of Mexico, as shown in this little cartoon over here. Anyone who's lived in Miami more than about 6 months knows that we have 2 seasons here. In the summer is our rainy, wet season, and in the winter, which we're kind of wrapping up now, is our dry, not so rainy season. And of course, the Everglades, being a wetland, responds to the seasonal cycle as well. During the summer, water levels rise, flow increases, and then in the winter, when it's not raining so much, the water levels drop and the flow decreases. So there's an annual variation of about a meter or so of water level, so from here to here. Because the landscape is so flat, a meter of water level makes a big difference, and it varies from place to place, because that's also about the range of topographic relief we have in this landscape. From the low spots to the high spots is again about a meter, which means that the low spots in our environment kind of the dark purples in this image, spend most of the year underwater. And the high spots in the landscape, the yellows and oranges, spend most of the year out of the water. So relatively subtle variation in topography, again, about this much, make a big effect on the hydrologic regime experienced across the Everglades landscape. And because this is a wetland ecosystem, this hydrology, which is governed by the topography, in turn affects the ecology. So we have different plant communities that favor different hydrologic regimes. Some plants like to be underwater most of the year. Other plants don't. So we get different vegetation communities on these different parts of the landscape. So that's kind of how the Everglades worked in its natural configuration up to about 150 years ago. And that gave rise to this very diverse ecosystem we have. But if you look on this image, you also see a lot of very unnatural looking straight lines. And that's because this is no longer in its natural configuration. This first got started in the late 19th century with the development of agriculture south of Lake Okeechobee. You can't grow crops underwater. So they dug a bunch of canals to try to divert the water from Lake Okeechobee that used to flow south and feed the Everglades out to the coasts that way and drain the land to the south for agriculture. That was kind of the first main phase of human hydrologic modification here. And the primary result here was a substantial reduction in the southward flow through the Everglades, because the water that used to go from Lake Okeechobee down nice shallow sheet flow across the landscape is now channelized in these canals to go out to the coasts. The second main phase of hydrologic disturbance occurred after World War II, motivated by the increasing urbanization of the Miami-Dade area, as well as two major hurricanes in the 1940s. So they developed what's called the Central and South Florida Flood Control Project, where they're trying to manage water here not just to drain for agriculture, but to protect the urban environment. This was achieved through the construction of a whole bunch of canals, all of these red lines here, and levees to separate this system into a series of isolated compartments. It's a little small there, but these are called water conservation areas, 1, 2, and 3, which are these isolated compartments separated by levees and canals, with the water flow between them governed by man-made control structures. So that led to more or less our present configuration, where what used to be a large continuous wetland has now been sliced and diced up into these separated compartments, with the flow through this ecosystem pretty much entirely controlled by anthropogenic control structures governed by the South Florida Water Management District. So the Everglades we have today is a very managed ecosystem. Now, in the late 20th century, public sentiment started to shift a little bit, where nature was no longer just a force to be opposed and controlled, but greater recognition came about for the natural benefits, both here and around the country and the world. And this motivated a shift to try to reverse some of the past changes to the hydrologic regime that have been imposed by all of these construction projects. In 2000, Congress passed the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which is a very ambitious effort to not get rid of the infrastructure, but get rid of some of it and rearrange what's there to better replicate the natural flow, both the timing and the magnitude of freshwater discharge down through what's left of the Everglades. When they passed it in 2000, they thought they would be done in 2030. It's now 2026, and they're saying 2050. So we'll see. But substantial progress has been made. Here's kind of the cartoon of the goal. They're not getting rid of all the infrastructure. We're not going to get rid of all of these black lines, but use it, reconfigure it, get rid of what we can to better replicate the original natural flow through the remaining Everglades. Substantial progress has already been made. If you drive west out on the Tamiami Trail through the Everglades, you'll notice that you go over these bridges. 30 years ago, those bridges were a surface level road on a levee, blocking the southward water flow. So this is an attempt to better connect the water from up here down here and restore some of the past connectivity that was disrupted by construction. So that's kind of the stage for the stories that we can try to then figure out. The big picture questions that I am trying to figure out in my research are: one, can we systematically measure changes to the landscape that have occurred during this time period? These changes in water management infrastructure have changed the hydrology, and because this is a wetland ecosystem, that in turn has affected the ecology. So can we measure that in a spatially and temporally explicit way? Can we then use that information, the spatial patterns, the time history, to connect that to different environmental drivers, different things that have happened across the landscape over that time? And let's bring it back to the human story. How have these changes in hydrology resulted from changes in human activities? So the approach I'm going to use for this is remote sensing. So using data like this satellite image here. This is a Landsat 5 satellite image collected in 1985. And as you can see from this picture, there are advantages to a remote sensing approach. The biggest one is it works at a very large spatial scale. With the click of a button, you can download a data set that covers the entire Everglades. So if you want to think about big picture questions, this can be a useful approach. The remote sensing data we have available here covers a relatively long temporal baseline. The oldest data I'll show you here goes back to 1940. And while that's not all the way back to a truly pristine, unmodified Everglades, it covers a lot of the history of human modification. But like any scientific technique, remote sensing also has its limitations. And we always need to keep these limitations in mind for anything we do. Probably the biggest one of remote sensing is that it's a very indirect measurement of whatever it is you actually want to know. This image here was measured by a satellite that was measuring reflected electromagnetic radiation after it had gone through the atmosphere and back. That is only very indirectly related to vegetation and land cover. So converting that information, which is essentially just reflected or emitted electromagnetic radiation, into something more useful and more directly relevant is inherently a rather indirect proxy. So to make sense of information like this, you need good, what we call ground truth data, ways to interpret this in the context of what it actually represents on the ground. Another limitation that I'll show you today is that the data coverage and the data quality vary through time. In the last 10 years, we have an enormous wealth of data of all different modalities, resolutions, timelines, you name it. But the farther back you go, the less and less you have. Now, without a time machine, we can't go back and get more, so that's what we're stuck with, but it does present some logistical challenges that I'll show you. This is the oldest imagery we have that I've gotten my hands on. It's from 1940. It's collected by the US Department of Agriculture. Does anybody know where this area here on the left is? Nice agricultural fields.
Yes, that's racetrack. Ooh, we start these boats.
It's a good guess. That's actually the Tropical Park racetrack before it was Tropical Park. And that's where we are right here. So that's 8th Street. This canal is now where the turnpike runs. But in 1940, none of that was here. Nothing really existed west of Coral Gables. So these are some of the images we have that can go back farther than the satellite era, but making sense of these presents its own challenges as well, which we'll talk about later. So the first little vignette I want to share is about tree islands. So this is part of the PhD work of my PhD student, Nick. And what he's trying to understand is how can we map out the changes to these tree islands through time. So what is a tree island? Tree islands are these things you can see here in green. They're stands of dense hardwood vegetation that form these discrete islands in the Everglades. Shown here of these higher emergent canopies, those are tree islands, and they're set within the ambient sawgrass marsh that occupies most of the landscape. They tend to form this characteristic elongated teardrop shape aligned with the direction of water flow. And because, again, this is a seasonally flooded wetland ecosystem, their occurrence depends on hydrology, which depends on topography. The reason they're called tree islands is that they occupy the higher elevation parts of the landscape. The area shown here in yellow and orange that stick up a meter or so from the surrounding landscape, which means that they have a substantially shorter hydroperiod. They spend much less of the year underwater and are thus hospitable to these sorts of hardwood trees that don't like to grow underwater all year round. So the questions that we're going to try to address are, how has the tree island area changed in the last 40 years? Because these are very sensitive to changes in water level, they've experienced a lot of disturbance from all of the changes in hydrology. If you've heard the phrase ghost island, they're basically dead trees that used to be a tree island. So here's a nice one right here. In the green there, that's living hardwood vegetation. That magenta stuff there, that's dead trees. They basically got flooded. The hydroperiod was too long for that vegetation, and so they died. So can we measure that in a systematic, quantitative way? And then from those measurements, can we figure out how it varies across the landscape? And can we use that spatial variation to understand how it relates to changes in the hydrologic regime? So the data sets we're going to use this primarily are Landsat satellite imagery. This goes back to about 1985. Here's two images from about 40 years apart. Landsat is a satellite data product that samples a bunch of different spots on the electromagnetic spectrum. If you take a picture with your phone or a standard commercial camera, you sample 3 parts of the spectrum, red, green, and blue, because that's the part of the spectrum that we can observe with our eyes. But Landsat and many other satellite imagery missions cover a much broader range of the spectrum. So it includes the blue, green, and red of the visible that we can see with our eyes, but it's also measuring a number of different spectral bands that we can't see, but are very useful for land cover detection. In particular, vegetation shows a lot of variation in the infrared here. So all of these different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum are recorded in this Landsat imagery. This gives us a very highly dimensional data set, which is very useful for discriminating between different land cover classes and different sorts of vegetation. For every year in our study period, we combine both a wet season and a dry season composite to, again, increase the dimensionality of our data set. Because different parts of the landscape respond differently to changes in water level, if we can leverage those seasonal differences, we can give basically more power to discriminate among these different land cover classes. For the hydrography, when we want to tie this back to the hydrologic regime, we use data from the US Geological Survey. So I'm sure some of you have seen this before, but the USGS has a nice network of water gauging stations throughout the Everglades, all of those blue dots. Each one of those is recording in real time and broadcasting on the internet. You can go find it. And then from those, they have published daily interpolated water surfaces for every day going back to 1991. So that's 35 years of water level history across the entire Everglades region, which we can use to think about spatial and temporal variations in hydrologic regime. The approach we're going to use to process our satellite imagery is what we call supervised classification. This is a machine learning technique where you train a classifying algorithm to differentiate between different land cover classes based on the spectral reflectance from the imagery. And a key part of any supervised classification algorithm is what we call the training data. And this is just places where you already know the answer. In our case here, we're trying to predict the response variable, which is land cover class for vegetation, from the input predictor variables, which is our satellite imagery. So for our training data set, we need to know both. Now, of course, we know our predictor variables everywhere all the time because we have this rich satellite data set. So for our response variable, we're using a South Florida Water Management District land cover data set to train this classifying algorithm. And then once you do that, the power of this is you can then apply it to times where you don't already know the answer. And as long as you can convince yourself that your classifier is reasonably accurate, and there are ways we can do that, then you can use that to classify your other data sets as well and estimate the land cover across our study period. So here's just what this looks like. So here's again our false color satellite image. This is just 3 of the bands, but there are 6 for 2 different seasons. And from that information and the input training data, where we already knew the answer, the random forest classifier will produce this map of land cover classes. And you can see it does a nice job pulling out these tree islands, all of these bright green spots here. Here's just a bigger picture across the broader Everglades region. And we can make maps such as these every time we have satellite imagery. Here's a snapshot of a few of them. There are more than I didn't have room to fit. But we can make these classification maps at different times from different satellite images. So now we have a temporally and spatially explicit history of land cover class predicted from satellite imagery. So we can use that to measure change. Here's a change map from 1985 to 2025, so 40 years. Some of the stuff up here might be spurious, but if we look down here, we start to see some coherent signals. Everything shown in green here is a stable tree island, meaning it was a tree island in 1985, and it's still a tree island today. Everything shown in red, that's loss. It used to support hardwood vegetation, and now it doesn't. The gain are areas that we predicted have gained hardwood vegetation. And then everything in yellow is stuff that wasn't a tree island before and still isn't. So mostly just sawgrass marsh. There are some spatial trends we can observe. So towards the kind of upstream ends of our water conservation areas, we see largely stable tree islands. And these are the areas that have experienced less disturbance through hydrologic regime. Towards the downstream ends, where we have more ponding, more flooding, that's where we see more die-off. And this is consistent with what we expect. These are areas that don't like to be underwater. So if you have an artificially increased hydroperiod, you're going to make those areas no longer favorable for this sort of vegetation. We can also look at it through time. The wiggles here are noise. The next version of this graph is going to include uncertainty, but we're still going through that analysis. But we can see that there has been overall net loss of tens of square kilometers over this time period.
We do have fluctuation.
This is classification noise. So we're going through the process of actually estimating the uncertainty. And what I expect is the interannual fluctuations will be within uncertainty. What I hope, and we won't find out until we're done with it, is that there will still be some sort of signal that's larger than the interannual uncertainty. But stay tuned. But we can see that it's not steady, that most of the loss occurred in the first 2 decades, and that we had more or less steady within noise for the past 15 years or so. So perhaps this is encouraging. Perhaps this means that the Everglades restoration that's happened so far has been successful. That is shifting the hydrologic regime back towards what it used to be and slowing down the decline of these environments that were disrupted. That's perhaps a happy ending. We can look at the spatial patterns as well. So here's the same thing, just tipped on its side, so we can zoom in a little bit. So here are areas of high mortality, over here and over here. Over here, we don't see so much. So we can think about how does the spatial pattern relate to the hydrology. And we can use that by using spatially explicit estimates of hydrologic regime. So these are averaging over the last 35 years, where we have this USGS data. This is the average depth of flooding. Blue means on average the water surface is above the ground surface. Red is the water table below the surface. And over here we have the mean hydroperiod. So how much of the year you spend underwater. And it mostly looks blue, but if you zoom in, there is spatial structure, again, because of the spatial structure of topography. Our higher elevation areas, like this one here, those are areas with lower flooding and shorter hydroperiods. So we can combine these maps with this map to try to think about thresholds. How much flooding is too much flooding for trend. And we find that we get more than about 50% probability of loss once you exceed about 30 centimeters of mean annual flooding. So once you get above about that much water, the tree islands can't survive. So this is how we can use these large-scale, spatially explicit estimates of hydrology and land cover to start to think about these drivers in a quantitative way. We still have a lot more work to do on here. Everything I'm going to show you today is just a work in progress, but hopefully this is a sample of some interesting things we'll be able to come up with in the next few years as Nick finishes his PhD. The second story I want to tell today, we're going to shift downstream. So far I've been looking up in here in kind of the classical freshwater Everglades with your sawgrass marsh, your hardwood tree islands. But as our freshwater flows down slope, eventually it reaches the ocean. It reaches Florida Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. As you might expect, there is a transition from freshwater to saltwater as these two things mix. And because, again, hydrology determines ecology, there's an ecological transition that occurs as well. In the salty part of the Everglades, we find mangroves. These are salt-tolerant tree species that mostly live in the intertidal zone, in this tidally mixed area where we have brackish water. Anytime we think about, this is what they look like. This is from Hell's Bay, down in Everglades National Park. These are our mangrove trees. This is tidally mixed water here. Anytime we think about a coastal environment, we always need to think about sea level. This is another interest of mine, thinking about how sea level is buried through the geologic past. And if we look at geologic records of sea level change in South Florida, we find that the late Holocene, since about 6,000 years ago, has been characterized by slow but steady sea level rise of about 0.6 of a millimeter per year. This is because of our position on the outer edge of the peripheral bulge of the Laurentide ice sheet. So when you grew ice over Canada, you pushed up the land around it. Now that the ice is gone, Canada's going up and we're going down. And that ongoing land subsidence causes sea level rise. So even though we haven't really had substantial change in ice volume for about the last 6,000 years, here in Florida, we've still had slow but steady sea level rise. As I'm sure you guys all know, that picture has changed recently because of anthropogenic climate change, melting of ice sheets, steric expansion, and accelerating sea level rise. So here's another data set based on tide gauge data in the early part and satellite data for the more recent decades, showing sea level predictions in Florida Bay. And since 1890, we've had about 30 centimeters of sea level rise. Now that's not a lot in the grand scheme of things, but again, this is a very low relief landscape, so it doesn't take a lot of change to start really affecting things. We look at the rate of sea level change, it's gone up a lot. So in green here, this is our late Holocene rate constrained by geologic data, about 0.6 of a millimeter per year, plus or minus 0.3. And in blue here is the 10-year moving trend, 20-year moving trend of this data. And we see that sea level rise has gone up to 6 or more millimeters per year recently. Shimon said 9 in his paper. And I think if you continue this trend, that's what you'd find. So more than 10 times what we had in the late Holocene. That's a big increase. Now we have remote sensing data going back to 1940 that captures about 20 centimeters of sea level rise. So with that, we can start to think about how changes in sea level and changes in hydrology have affected changes in ecology over that interval. So let's think about how an ecosystem responds to sea level rise. The simplest way to think about it is just the sea surface intersecting a sloping land surface. When you rise sea level, that intersection point moves inland, and the amount it moves inland will be the vertical sea level change divided by the topographic slope. The Everglades is a very low slope environment, So you can actually get a lot of horizontal transgression that way. If we take our 20 centimeters of sea level rise since 1940, divide it by the topographic slope, which is about 5 centimeters per kilometer, we get a horizontal transgression of about 4 kilometers. That's easily enough to measure from remote sensing imagery. Now, of course, this is a very simplistic view of how the world works. And in the case of the Everglades, it's not just salt water intersecting the land surface, but it's a freshwater wetland grading into a saltwater wetland. So it's really the mixing zone between our freshwater and our saltwater that determines that ecological transition. So of course, if you raise sea level, that halocline will shift inwards. But there are other things going on as well. If you change your water discharge, you can shift that halocline upstream or downstream, even for the same amount of sea level rise. And in this ... there are of course many other complicating factors as well. In the case of mangroves, you have to think about how mangroves disperse. They're trees, they don't have feet. So somehow, if they want to expand up slope, they need to get there. And those biological processes of dispersal are probably an important part of the story as well. So the questions that I would like to address, and I'm going to show you only very, very preliminary results, are: what is the magnitude of inland mangrove advance in response to rising sea levels and inland shifting salinity transitions? And how does it vary both in space along the coastline and in time across our 85 years of data? And then how can we explain those trends? If sea level rise is just causing a horizontal transgression inversely proportional to the topographic slope, then we should be able to explain the spatial variation in terms of variations in slope. So we'll see how well that does. How does the rate through time compare to our sea level history? Does it proceed as we expect for a slow, steady sea level rise, or is it more complicated than that? It's always more complicated than that. Related to that, what is the role of changing freshwater discharge? How is that influencing the location of that salinity transition, and then how is that affecting ecology? So here we can go back farther in time than we had from our Landsat imagery, before we had any satellites up in space at all. And we're going to use historical aerial images collected mostly by the US Geological Survey. Here are some examples from 1950, 1995, and 2023. The more recent stuff from the 90s and on is pretty easy to use. It comes nicely georeferenced, you downloaded it, and you're ready to go. But the older ones take a little bit more work. So each one of these images is available online as a scan of a physical film strip that's sitting in a warehouse somewhere. So this is what you can download from the USGS website. Here's out in the Everglades, just south of the Tamiami Trail there. Here's downtown Miami, Miami Beach. And this is what you get. So these are the borders of the film strip. Handwritten notes about the flight line, the date, other information like that. To turn these data sets into something useful requires a little bit of work. I had an undergraduate and a master's student working on this project. And what we did is we used Agisoft Metashape photogrammetry software to take each one of these images, merge and mosaic them together, and then georeference them to create a usable mosaic data set. Because to cover the Everglades takes between 500 and 3,000 individual images, depending on the scale they're taken at. So we can't do that one by one, or we'd be here until I die. So we have to come up with some sort of derived product like this. So we did this for a number of different time slices, governed by the availability of data when they felt like flying an airplane. And so we have time slices every 1 to 2 decades or so, going back from 1940 up until the present day. So now we can start to measure how mangroves have shifted around. Other data sets I'm going to bring into bear, again, this sea level curve based on tide gauge data and satellite measurements give us a well-resolved chronology of sea level change during our study period from 1940 to the present. We have topography from airborne LiDAR measurements that give high-resolution topography across all of Florida and really most of the country. that we can use to estimate the gradient and where we expect sea level to be advancing. And then we're going to think about freshwater discharge. So I showed you this before when we were thinking about water depth, which is what the tree islands really care about. But now we need to think about not just how high is the water, but how much is it flowing. And we can do that using these water surfaces to compute a water surface slope and a digital elevation model to compute the water depth. And then from those, we can estimate the water discharge. So if you're familiar with Manning's equation or the Darcy-Weisbach formula, this will look familiar. Modeling discharge is a power law function of flow depth and water surface slope. I shamelessly stole parameters here from the USGS website to produce this chart here, which is a map of flow. The arrows show direction, and the length shows how much. This is units of discharge per unit width, so meters squared per second, because it's a totally unchannelized flow. That's how we measure it. But we can take this graph, this map, and we can integrate it across a transect to estimate freshwater discharge. So I just drew this red line more or less arbitrarily by eye to estimate how much fresh water is flowing out of Everglades down into our mangrove environment. We can do this going back to 1991 from these USGS measurements, and this is what we get. We see a clear seasonal cycle. Discharge goes up in the summer, as we expect. That's when it's raining, that's when water goes up. It goes down, sometimes to almost zero in the winter during our dry season. But that only gets us back to 1991. This is the era where we have a nice rich data set. So how can we think about discharge and water before that? So there are a few gauging stations that do go back farther. This one is the longest one that I'm aware of, but if anybody knows more, I'd love to hear. This is located at the base of the observation tower at the end of the Shark Valley tram loop. So if you ever go there, you're going up the ramp, take a look, and it's right there. And it's been taking measurements going back to the early 1950s. So we have a more or less continuous measurement with some gaps of water level at this one place at the western edge of the Shark River Slough going back to the 1950s. So what can we do with this? Well, this gets a little bit more conjectural because data is very sparse, but we'll see what we can do. So let's try to think about how we can model the freshwater discharge coming out of Everglades into our mangrove ecosystem as a function of the water level at this one place where we have information. And we can do that by leveraging these last 35 years where we know both. And I want to caution that discharge here again is just modeled from water surface. It's not actually measured because you can't really measure discharge in a non-channel flow in any sort of easy way. So the simplest way we can think about it is that we can model the discharge at one time as a function of the water surface height at that one time. You plot them against each other, it looks like this. There's a clear positive relationship as we expect. Water level goes up, discharge increases. Water level goes down, discharge decreases. There's also, as you probably expect, a lot of scatter. Because this is just one place. The Everglades is not homogeneous, doesn't just go all up and down together. Spatial variation in precipitation, water flow mean that this is at best an imperfect proxy for total discharge. But let's see what we can do. We can fit a curve to this data. This is a random forest regression, which is a useful technique if you don't necessarily know a priori what the shape of that function should be. It fits itself to the middle of that data cloud, as we like. If we plot our original data against the regression, we see that, again, there's a clear positive relationship, but again, there's scatter. We get an R squared of 0.81, so it's capturing most of the variation, but not all. We can look at it in time as well. So again, this is 1991 to the present, where we know what the right answer should be. And we see that for the most part, it does a pretty good job. It clearly gets the seasonal cycle. Water goes up, water goes down, discharge goes up, discharge goes down. It gets a lot of the intriannual variation more or less right, but it's not perfect. There are places where it gets it wrong, both mostly undershooting sometimes overshooting. And basically, it doesn't quite get the extremes very well. But we can't necessarily do much better, so let's see what happens if we extend it to the full time series. So if we extend this all the way back to 1950, the beginning of our record, we again see a seasonal cycle. We don't have any way to validate that because we just have our one gauging station here. But if we take this as an imperfect but hopefully useful representation of freshwater discharge, we see that it's actually increased by about 50% over the last 75 years. Some of this is due to just kind of normal variations in precipitation and probably climate change as well. There's a dry spell in here. Some of it, especially starting around here, is hopefully the result of Everglades restoration. There's increased water flow from the northern parts and water conservation areas down into the national park. So maybe this will be an interesting part of our story when we get back to the mangroves. A more sophisticated way we could think about it is maybe the discharge at one time depends not just on the water level at one time, but on time history. If the water level is rising or the water level is falling, maybe that gives us useful extra information that can help us do a better job of predicting the discharge. So we can do that using what's called a long short-term memory model. It's a type of recurrent neural network that works on time series data to predict an output from a time series of inputs. When we apply it to our data, we actually find out that it doesn't really do a better job than just a simple random forest regression. So I think what that means is there's just a substantial amount of inherent natural variability in the system that we can't capture with a single gauging station in one spot, which is probably to be expected. But we see a similar kind of long-term trend of increasing discharge, which mostly reflects increasing water level at this gauging station. So let's come back to the mangroves. From our remote sensing images, from our aerial images, we can measure how they've changed through time. So this is very preliminary, just manual tracing. But we can trace that inland limit at each one of those merged aerial photomosaics to get these lines here. This is what they look like on the map, and it's a little bit hard to make sense of it. So I'm going to kind of unravel it onto a transect here. So this white line here is our topographic transect, just paralleling the margin. And we can see how far have things moved in perpendicular to that transect. So kind of unwrap it here. I'm using 1940 as my baseline. And each one of those lines is how far in has that inland limit of the mangroves, that transition from freshwater to saltwater, migrated inland at each one of those years. Units up here are kilometers. So we see in some places it's 3, 4, up to 6 kilometers. In some places, it's less than 1. So there's substantial spatial variation along strike of our coastline here in how far inland these mangroves have migrated.
Where's zero? Is it zero in southeast to northwest or zero northwest?
So 0 is up here.
That's zero. Okay.
So we're going from 10,000 islands
Okay.
down over here to Shark River, which is here, and then Taylor Slough's over here. And those dots correspond to the tick marks there. So how can we explain this variability? Well, remember our simple hypothesis was topography. If you have a shallower slope, the same amount of sea will rise will move you in farther. If you have a steep slope, it won't move you in so far. So how do these variations in mangrove advance correspond to variations in topography? In some places, the story lines up. The place where we have the largest inland advance, that's in the Shark River Slough right here, that's our place with our lowest topographic gradient. So that works out well. This area here, the Taylor Slough, that's another area of low topographic gradient, lower advance in between. That more or less is consistent with our expectations. But if you go up to the west, up towards Everglades City, we see 3 or 4 kilometers in our area of steepest topographic gradient. So it's not just this. It explains some of the variation, but not all. We can also think about it in time. If we know more or less how much sea level has been rising, have the mangroves been steadily following that, or is it more complicated? It's more complicated. The dashed lines here are a simple prediction of sea level rise divided by slope varying in space and sea level rise varying in time. And we see that it kind of seems to be punctuated. We don't have a nice steady rise or a nice steady advance corresponding to our steady rise in sea level, but it kind of goes in fits and spurts. So over here, we had a big increase between 1950 and 1978, and then not much again until 2007. Even though the sea level rise is much more steady during that time. And we see similar things elsewhere. What I think this speaks to is the role of extreme events. These are not new ideas I'm about to say, but mangroves disperse because their propagules have to get dispersed somewhere. And hurricanes are really good ways to move mangroves inland. So these almost certainly correspond to hurricane dispersal events. I know that's been implicated down here in the place I'll show you in a little bit, which is over here. That's probably explaining this kind of pulsed migration. I'm certainly not the first to propose that, but I think with these data sets, we can start to think about that in a more spatially explicit and quantitative way, which I think is exciting, but I haven't gotten to that yet. If we think about freshwater discharge, this increase in freshwater discharge, which hopefully is real, should mean that that's mitigating the inland advance of that saltwater transition. That the sea level rise is probably partially offset by advancing freshwater front. And perhaps this explains why many areas have experienced much less migration of the mangroves relative to what we expect if we just had our sea surface intersecting the sloping land surface. I want to show you a few kind of zoom in case studies. So this here is the main national park road to Flamingo, off screen here. In 1950, the mangrove front was essentially parallel across that road. You fast forward to the present, we've seen several kilometers. The highest advance is actually up here when we get to the 6 kilometer value to the west of that road. But to the east of the road, we see almost no change at all. You can see the mangroves expanding out a little bit here. We're talking about maybe 100 meters, not kilometers and kilometers. And I think this is the result of the road's effect on hydrology. The water flows kind of from northeast to southwest here. So it's holding back the fresh water here, inhibiting saltwater advance, and enhancing saltwater advance over here. I know hurricanes have also been argued to play a role here for this dispersal event, so there's always more to the story. Groundwater probably also plays a role. But that very sharp linear contrast between mangroves over here and the freshwater ecosystem here shows that there must be something going on. If we go farther up the coast towards Everglades City, here we can see the transition from freshwater to saltwater in 1950. Fast forward to 2007, we can see again several kilometers of inland advance. So that's kind of what it looks like. The mangroves are taking over these formerly freshwater dominated habitats. This one I don't have a timing series of because it happened before our data coverage. But right here, that's a tree island, and it's surrounded by mangroves. Kind of a relic of our freshwater wetland, where the lower elevations around it have been taken over by the saltwater ecosystem. Again, because sea level has been slowly but steadily rising for thousands of years. And I expect that this will continue in the future as the mangroves slowly eat up what used to be a freshwater ecosystem. So mostly I've been looking at the inland limit, but I think it's also worth looking at the seaward limit. I haven't tried to quantify this at all, I just put in some nice pictures. But interestingly, we see that for the most part, the seaward limit of mangroves has not retreated the way the inland limit has advanced. Naively, you might think that this whole ecosystem could just track upslope, staying more or less the same width as it's eroded from the seaward side and advancing on the landward side. But at least for now, the seaward side is mostly holding its ground, which means that probably that vertical accretion within the mangroves is more or less keeping up for now. That probably won't be true forever. I know there have been tipping points identified from the geologic record that we're already approaching or even passing for where mangroves can't keep up. But at least for now, over the last 85 years, mangrove area is increasing mangroves seem to be winning from sea level change, if I can anthropomorphize a little bit. There have been some changes. So there's been a little bit of loss at the seaward edge. Here's 1950, 2007. And we see a little bit of loss, but it's a few hundred meters, nothing like the kilometers of inland migration we saw on the other side. Again, I think extreme events are almost certainly the dominant force here, and that in Florida means hurricanes. So we go from 1950 to 1978. We see a little bit of retreat. 1978, whoops. Sorry, not mean to do that. Share the screen again. Okay. From 1950. Sorry, the key actually got stuck down. From 1978, we see some loss. 1978 to 1995, almost nothing. 1995 to 2010, we see some loss. There were some hurricanes in there. 2010, 2013, not much. 2015, not much. Then this is right after Hurricane Irma. So everything here, these lighter colors that aren't showing up in that nice deep red, that's mortality. Trees that were killed. You can see it clearly in 2019. All of these areas here are dead. Now, much of it has come back in the interim, but we look at the seaward edge, that's never coming back. We basically lost the sediment there that was holding it together, and so bye-bye mangroves. As sea level rise continues, this presumably will also continue, and perhaps we'll reach a tipping point where vertical accretion is no longer able to maintain pace with sea level rise, and we'll start to get the kind of loss of the seaward edge that we're experiencing gain at the landward edge. But for now, mangroves are winning. So that's all very preliminary. Some next steps for how to do this in a hopefully more rigorous way. Beyond just our little manual tracing, we're developing a workflow to use a convolutional neural network to classify these aerial images. Because we don't have the spectral depth that we have for Landsat, a much lower dimensional data set, we need to be a little more careful. But these convolutional networks classify things on the basis of texture, not just spectral reflectance. And that's really useful for differentiating things from a monochrome image. We're thinking about ways to do a better job of this, how to hindcast our water levels from the sparse data that we do have. We have more than just this one station, but the farther back in time you go, the less you have. So Nick, my PhD student, is trying to think about data science techniques we can use, training on the time where we know it all, to figure out what was going on. Hopefully we can then incorporate that into a more rigorous model of water flow and salinity to try to figure out how these changes in hydrology might affect salinity patterns, which we can then compare with vegetation. I want to think in a more quantitative way about the role of extreme events. So can we measure the changes that result in different hurricanes and their cumulative effect over time? Can we measure how much is attributable to hurricanes and how much is more of a slow, steady process, kind of uniformitarianism versus catastrophism? And I think we have the data to do that. And the pie in the sky fantasy for the future is, can we put this all together to predict how things will change in the future? If we change hydrology from Everglades restoration, sea level will continue to rise, probably accelerate. How will all of that affect, in turn, the ecology? And that's all I have.